you. So the segments of the Tanakh. The Torah, the very first portion, is called the Teachings, or the 5 books of Moses, and this outlines rules and instructions, and also tells like the early creation stories, things like that, that are written down in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's important to note that most of these early stories of the Hebrews would have originally been passed down through what we call oral tradition. Can anyone tell me what that means? What does oral tradition mean? That's very good, Olivia. Olivia said that it was taught by speaking, not writing, and that's absolutely true. Yes, Alyssa, very good. It's stories, traditions, things like that passed down from one generation to the next by speaking it. Early people don't all have access to writing, so the only way they can preserve legends, myths, stories, histories is to speak them from one generation to the next. Now, this can mean that some of the information changes over time or may not be super historically accurate. But they did the best they could to preserve what information and stories they had. And then eventually, they do develop writing and they start to actually write down that information. The second segment of the Tanakh, the prophets, is made up of several books like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings that you might recognize. And then the third portion, the writings, contains poetry, theology, and drama. And love letters and all sorts of different things are in that portion. So it's much more eclectic than some of the others. You do need to be vaguely familiar with those different segments of the Tanakh. And yeah, we pretty much made it through all of this. So going to move on to today. Today we're actually going to go into some of the actual history of the early Hebrews. Now, keep in mind, a lot of this is, once again, these are stories. We may not be able to historically confirm a lot of this information, but we can't historically confirm a lot of very early written information. So that's just kind of the way it is sometimes. Regardless, the Tanakh traces the Hebrews back to a man named Abraham, who, according to the story, was told by God to leave his home in Mesopotamia and take his family west. This story may sound very familiar to many of you, especially if you've spent any time in a Christian church, because Christianity stems from Judaism. And so a lot of the early stories are basically the same thing. Now, Yahweh, that's the name of the Hebrew God, promised to take Abraham to a new land and make his descendants into a mighty nation. They settle in this area called Canaan, which is between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, as you can see on the map to the right side of your screen. Now, some of Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, live in Canaan for many years. However, many of them moved further south to Egypt because there is a famine in Canaan. What is a famine? Who can tell me what a famine is? That's correct, Megan. When there's no food. When there is a food shortage, we refer to it as a famine. Who can tell me what a drought is? That's right, Megan. When there's not enough water, not enough rain, not enough water, often drought leads to famine, especially in the ancient world where there's not like already people are to survive typically. So there's a drought in Canaan. The people of the descendants of Abraham, many of them travel further south, staying in Egypt, where they actually flourish and their population grows. Now, according to the story, the Pharaoh of Egypt, the name of which we are not sure of, we don't have any sort of direct explanation for which Pharaoh, who this would be. Lots of people have different theories, but the fact of the matter is we have no idea. Okay, so the Pharaoh of Egypt is afraid that the Israelites are going to become too powerful and maybe overpower the Egyptians in their own land, and so he enslaves them. Now, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt for a pretty significant amount of time until, according to the Tanakh, a leader named Moses appears in the late 1200s BC. Have you guys heard of Moses before? At least heard the name? Good, so at least some of you are familiar. So, according to the story, Moses is told by God to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt, and he goes to Egypt to do so. Now, the Pharaoh of Egypt at the time refuses to allow them to leave, and so God sends 10 plagues on the land of Egypt, which are pretty frightening and intimidating to the Egyptians. And eventually the Pharaoh decides that it's not worth the extra trouble, and he allows the Hebrews to leave Egypt and to leave. This is called the Exodus. The second book of the Christian Bible is likewise called Exodus, just like the second book of the Torah is called the Exodus. And it's the story of the Hebrews, their enslavement in Egypt and their leaving of Egypt. And so that event is called the Exodus. You need to be familiar with the term Exodus and what that means. It's a very important story in Hebrew tradition. So, after some years wandering, oh, there's a typo here. After some years wandering, the Hebrews return to Canaan, where they originally came from. But while they're there, they have to fight to regain the territory that they lost, because there are other people groups living in that region as well, which leads to a rather violent and bloody conquest portion of the Torah. They end up building their own society, living in small scattered villages. Now, this is very important. Small scattered communities. They are not united as one nation at that time in their history. So they actually have leaders of each community called judges. These judges are responsible for enforcing laws. They settle disputes. They lead their people, but on a smaller scale. Again, they're not united as one people. Not really. They don't have a central government. And that's kind of important. You guys need to go to lunch. Please go orderly and come back. Dr. Turner is waiting for you. Okay. Going to lunch. Okay. So they built their own little small scattered communities. They're led by judges. They enforce laws. They settle disputes. Now, here's the thing. That works for a while, but it's kind of difficult to stay independent and not be conquered by the many, many violent groups of people in the ancient world if you're in tiny, small communities. So they face a new threat in the mid-1000s BC from a group of people called the Philistines. The Philistines invade Israel, and this, as a result, forces the Israelites to look for a new kind of leader. And this is how Israel ends up with its first king. So, in the mid-1000s BC, this is very important. The invasion of the Philistines into the lands of Israel causes them to unite behind one king, and that king's name is Saul, Saul, the first king of Israel. You need to know that name and be familiar with this. So, they unite behind Saul. Saul's relatively successful, at least as a military commander. But as a leader, he is not super well respected. The people don't unite behind him completely. And keep in mind, this is a group of people that they're not used to following one sovereign. They've been separated into smaller groups for a pretty long time. And so they don't really back Saul up like you might expect. In fact, he's kind of constantly having to deal with tribal and religious leaders who are undermining his authority, questioning him, that sort of thing, because they think independently. How dare they? So Saul ends up not being a super strong or successful king in that way. However, when he dies, he is not succeeded by his son or a child of his. In fact, that's the end of his line there. Not the end of his line, but he doesn't become the next king. He doesn't have a dynasty, is what I'm trying to get at. Instead, a new man named David becomes the second king of Israel. David's going to be much more successful than Saul. Now, there's a story in the Torah and in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible that says that David, during the war against the Philistines, actually, as a very young man, killed a giant named Goliath that was on the side of the Philistines with a slingshot. With a sling and a rock, not a slingshot. He slays this Philistine and gets a lot of renown for having accomplished that. So he's already kind of a war hero at a very young age. And he was also very much admired for his military skills, his poetry. Yes, David was a poet. There are pieces of poetry attributed to David in the Tanakh. So David ends up being pretty well loved by the Israelites. He lives in exile in the desert for many years because Saul actually declares him an outlaw and banishes him. And so he lives in the desert for a while. He gathers support, and when the time comes, he uses that support to become the next king when Saul dies. And he's respected. The people unite behind him. He's well loved by the Israelites. Tribal leaders often support him, so he's not questioned as much as Saul, and generally just has an easier time of it with all of that. He establishes the capital city of Israel, Jerusalem. This is important. You need to know what Jerusalem is because it's very significant throughout the rest of Hebrew and Jewish history. Now, David's going to have a son named Solomon, and that son is going to inherit the throne. And so David establishes a dynasty because someone of his line becomes the next king. Solomon takes the throne in 965 AD. He's also a strong leader. He expands Israel's prosperity through trade. Israel becomes wealthy during his time as king. And because of that wealth, he is able to build a large temple, a great temple to the Hebrew God in Jerusalem. And this is called Solomon's Temple, and it is very important, okay? The temple is going to have a lot of significance in Jewish history, so make a note of that. It's going to come back later several times. Anyone have any questions? All right. So that said, Solomon dies around 930 BC, and they have a hard time deciding who's going to be the next king, which is unfortunate. The nation of Israel actually divides into two separate kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So, because there's a disagreement between two different men who want to be leaders and want to be the next king, they can't decide on who it is, so they just create two separate nations, which weakens Israel naturally. They're no longer united into one nation. Now, the people of Judah become known as Jews at this time, and that's where the term Judaism is going to come from as well. Both kingdoms last for several centuries. However, the Assyrians invade around 722 BC and defeat Israel. The people of Israel scatter to the winds, and then Judah lasts a little longer, but ultimately they're defeated by the Chaldeans, and they'll be taken into slavery in Babylon. The Chaldeans captured Jerusalem and destroyed Solomon's temple in 586 BC. Which is something that's going to happen more than once. They try to rebuild that temple, and they do, and then it's going to be destroyed later again. So this keeps happening to the Jews. It's a common theme throughout Jewish history. Now, the people of Jerusalem are marched to Babylon. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them are marched to Babylon. They're enslaved for about 50 years, and this is called the Babylonian captivity. You need to be familiar with what the Babylonian captivity is. However, the Persians conquer the Chaldeans in the 530s BC. They conquer Babylon, and then the Jews return home, or many of the Jews are allowed to return home to Jerusalem under the Persians. Not all of them choose to do so, however. Many of them actually move to other parts of the Persian Empire. They spread out. They don't all stay in one place. Now, this is very important. This dispersal of the Jews is called the Diaspora, Diaspora, and it's one of many. There are multiple diasporas throughout history, and each of them marks a time period during which the Jews spread out and generally settle in smaller communities in other nations. As you might imagine, this actually makes them pretty vulnerable. Being a minority group in a nation populated by people who are different from you and who view you as very different tends to put that minority group in danger, and the Jews are going to be the target of discrimination throughout their history. It's part of the reason why it was decided after World War II that a homeland would be established for the Jews. Israel, that land in Canaan, would be given back to them. However, people already lived there, and that land had been taken over by the British, and then the British decided to establish this new homeland for the Jews. People that already lived there, the Palestinians, don't particularly appreciate that. It's been their land for a very long time now, and they are not pleased. And so it's caused a lot of conflict in the region between Palestinians and Israelis that have settled there. Skip that for now. Now, many Jews did return to Jerusalem. However, and they rebuild the temple. So this is the second temple. The first temple has been torn down by the Chaldeans, and now they have rebuilt a second temple in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem remains under the control of the Persian Empire until 330s BC. The Persians are conquered by Greek invaders at this time, or Macedonian invaders, because Macedonians they're basically Greek. Group of Greeks. Now, the Jews are kind of tired of being under the control of foreign nations. So there's actually a revolt in the 160s BC against these Macedonian invaders, which is successful, and also where the holiday of Hanukkah comes from. We'll get into that later. The Jews rule their own kingdom again for about a century, and then in 63 BC, they are conquered again, this time by the Roman Empire. Escaping the grasp of the Roman Empire is less than easy. And so we will actually continue tomorrow with the Roman Empire and its occupation of Jerusalem. Does anyone have any questions?